Hello, we're going to look at AC 2.2 of Unit 4 today. As you can see behind me, Christmas tree's up, so I'm recording this around about Christmas time. If you're watching it around about Christmas time, happy Christmas. If you're not, well, there you go. So, AC 2.2, discuss the aims of punishment. Now, this is a key AC within the Unit 4 exam. And as you can see here from the syllabus that I've just put up, you are expected to know 5 aims of punishment, and I'm going to go through each of these in detail in this PowerPoint: retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence, public protection and reparation. But the other key thing you're expected to be able to do is link those aims through to the criminological theories that we've learnt in Unit 2. And I'll be doing that for each of the aims, so you've got an idea of which theories you can apply to which aim. And the other key thing you've also got to be aware of is think about the different types of punishment that are handed out in our courts or magistrates' courts in society today, be they fines, imprisonment, community service, discharge, whatever. And then you have to think about how these link to the different aims of punishment. And most of the punishments we give out in courts today are linked to at least 3 of each of the aims of punishment, so more than one without a shadow of a doubt. And we've got a little exercise at the end of this PowerPoint to get you crystallising your thinking on that. So without further ado, let's crack on. And perhaps something to think about: why do we punish? Well, the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 says the purpose of sentencing is as follows. It's the punishment of offenders, the reduction of crime, including reduction of deterrence, the reform and rehabilitation of offenders, the protection of the public, and the making of reparation by offenders to persons affected by their offence. Now, I would just think that maybe the people that wrote the syllabus were looking at this section of the Criminal Justice Act, because other than using that word punishment instead of retribution, there are all the 5 aims of punishment outlined in that quote from the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. So it's almost as if the examiners are taking that section of the Criminal Justice Act and applying it to the syllabus. So I put a good exam quote, not a bad one to have when you're considering the aims of punishment, but it's up to you whether you choose to learn it or not. So the Criminal Justice Act also says that when sentencing, so when a magistrate or a judge is passing out a sentence, the 3 R's should always be present. So the sentence should be serving to rehabilitate the offender. It should be making reparation to the victims of the crime, and it should be retribution in general to society. So have a think about those, because they should be present in every sentence that is handed out. Right, let's think about our punishment categories that we have in this country. This is old hat really. We have custodial sentences. These could be mandatory, discretionary life sentences, fixed term sentences, suspended sentences, such as prison. We've got community sentences. This could be unpaid work, a curfew, drug treatment and testing, supervision, treatment programs, probation, etc. So like here we go, community payback. All these could be fines, and those are very much dependent on financial circumstances of the offender, their means tested, and of course the seriousness of the offence. And here we've got an enforcement order where someone has been made to pay some fines there: £100 for breach of the peace, £150 for assault, the criminal law consolidation fine of £300, and a breach of the peace another £200. So all in all, a fine there of £750. And you can see how that's done. And of course our final category is discharges, which is conditional. They can be conditional, so if the defendant, let's say, reoffends during this time up to 3 years, the courts can give a different sentence, or the discharge can be absolute where no penalty is implied. The defendant's guilty but blameless, so that's what we mean by a discharge. Just a reminder, who gives out the punishments? Well, it's judges who've got unlimited powers. They're just restricted by the sentence the offence carries. So, e.g., if someone is convicted of theft, the maximum sentence a judge can give in today's courts is 7 years. So that's the judge. Then we've got our magistrates. They are limited powers, so for one offence they can give 6 months in prison and or a fine, or 2 or more offences, 12 months in prison and or a fine. And of course they're not limited now to the size of fine they can give. And then finally we've got the police, so they've got limited powers, but they can hand out fixed penalty notices for things like motoring offences and minor disorder offences, such as causing harassment, being drunk and disorderly, consuming alcohol in a designated public place or highway, shoplifting, retail theft, up to the value of £200. And they can also give you a fixed penalty notice for possession of cannabis and for various fireworks offences. So let's start with our first aim, which is retribution, which literally means paying back. So it's inflicting a punishment on an offender for a wrong or a criminal act. And it's very much, and hence my cartoon up here, it's very much an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So it's based on the idea that criminals should get their just deserts. The punishment should fit the crime. It should be proportional. Now, we don't have it in this country, but you could argue that the best example of retribution would be the death penalty for murder. You take a life, therefore we take your life. So retribution is based on that biblical concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's a quote from the Old Testament, and that's why some people argue for the death penalty for murder. So this idea of proportionality, that has led very much to a tariff system, a fixed scale of mandatory penalties for different offences. So as I mentioned in my previous slide, theft up to 7 years in prison. These are fixed tariffs. You have to give them a life. If you're convicted of murder in this country, it is a life imprisonment. The judge has to give a life imprisonment. So if we then go through for some examples of retribution, well, obviously retribution's main purpose is to express society's outrage at a crime. And this is why we have things such as sentencing uplifts. So to give an example of this, hate crimes such as racially motivated offences now carry an uplift. So you used to get a maximum of 5 years for GBH, but there's now an uplift which makes it 7 years maximum if the GBH is racially motivated. So what that's doing is expressing society's greater outrage at the offence. We're not saying that GBH is a good thing, but it's even worse if it's racially motivated. And I've used this example as this photo as an example of retribution. This is a scold's bridle, and that was a metal brace that was put over the heads of women from the 16th century onwards, and it had a metal plate here that pressed down on the tongue that would prevent the woman from talking. And this was a public shaming punishment. So it's retribution for when women had been spreading gossip or lies, which often affected so-called respectable people. It's quite obviously it's extremely sexist and playing to female stereotypes, but nevertheless this punishment was about, and of course was only given to women. So it's an idea, it's an example of retribution. Moving on, some American ideas of retribution. I dug these out. So these are examples of judges that have handed out some quite unique penalties for theft, where they are made to wear signs saying that they are a thief. And if you want more examples of those, if you key in those, either click on the link or key in those links in YouTube, you will see some very amusing examples of just these sort of punishments. So I commend those to you. Enjoy. Okay, these are some local examples of retribution. I've gone to America, but if we go to Plymouth, you can just check on the Devon Live website, where every month the criminals that have been up in the courts are named and shamed in the paper with their photographs. So another example of local retribution. Again, you can go and have a look at those via looking at the link if you so wish. So obviously it's quite clear that retribution contains an element of revenge, because society and of course the victim of the crime are being avenged for the wrongdoing that they have suffered. The criminal has broken society's laws, so therefore society has to show its displeasure. So further examples of this are longer prison sentences for causing death by dangerous driving. They were justified in this way. As a result of lengthy campaigns by relatives of victims of death by dangerous driving, the Drive for Justice campaign, the maximum prison sentence was increased from 5 years to 10 years for this offence in 1993. Then we get to the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, it goes up to 14 years. And in June 2022 of this year, I'm recording this in December 22, the maximum sentence has been increased to life. So if you kill someone while you're under the influence of, let's say, drugs or alcohol, potentially you can get life imprisonment. So there's an example of how retribution has informed our policies in terms of how the public feel about death by dangerous driving. And there's a website you can go and look at about the change in the law, and that's a lorry firm that's embracing that change in the law in 2022 about death by dangerous driving. And there is a actual piece that I've taken from the actual law, which stipulates exactly what's going to change in terms of death by dangerous driving. So that was the big change in 2022. That was the one about where drivers, you had to give away, you had to give more space to bikes, you had to let pedestrians cross if you were turning left. But what a lot of people didn't realise in that law is actually the death by dangerous driving was upped to life. So an example of a law that's changed very recently. Over onto our links to Unit 2 then. Let's think about what criminological theories would be linked to retribution. And obviously right realism should spring to mind straight away. The idea of rational choice theory, the idea that offenders are rational human beings, because retribution assumes that these criminals have made a rational choice to consciously commit their crimes and therefore are fully responsible for their actions. Therefore they deserve the outrage of society for what they've chosen to do. So you could link right realism in there with no trouble whatsoever. You could look at sociological theories such as functionalism. Durkheim would say that the moral outrage that retribution expresses performs that function of boundary maintenance. Punishing the offender reminds everyone of the difference between right and wrong. So those are the sort of theories that you could tie in perhaps to retribution. Just some things to think about. I call this evaluation, but actually these slides are more about to consider. You could argue that there's an issue with retribution in that offenders deserve forgiveness or a chance to make amends, and retribution is just punishment, no more. There's no attempt at trying to improve offenders. You could say that fixed tariffs mean that punishment has to be inflicted even when no good is going to come for it. You know, you could argue a remorseful offender who will not commit further crimes still has to face that fixed tariff. Don't know how you feel about that, but some people argue that's not a good thing. And then you could also say, well, you know, how do you decide what is a proportionate penalty? And I think this is an interesting thing to consider here. You know, what is a just desert for a crime? If I asked a class to list in order what they thought were the 3 worst crimes that could be committed in terms of first worst crime, second crime, third crime, I suspect in the top 3 we'd probably have murder, rape and paedophilia, but I suspect that not everyone will have put them in the same order. My argument would be, well, if you can't decide which crime is more serious than another, how can you then decide what a proportionate tariff is? Because it's purely a subjective opinion. I'll leave that for you to consider. So moving on to our second aim after retribution, it begins with another R, rehabilitation. Now that's the idea that punishment can be used to reform or change offenders so they no longer offend and go on to live a crime-free life. So it's not really focusing on punishment, but it's trying to change the offender's future behaviour by addressing the issues which led to their offending in the first place. So this type of punishment is going to be much more geared towards treatment programs, such as education and training programs for prisoners so they can avoid unemployment, earn an honest living on release. It will be things like anger management courses for violent offenders, such as aggression replacement training, ART, and other cognitive behavioural therapy programs. Remember, we looked at these when we were looking at policies that were informed by criminological theories in Unit 2. And obviously drug treatment and testing orders and programs to treat alcohol dependence are all linked to this idea of rehabilitation. And finally, community service orders often include this element or this requirement for offenders to engage in these sort of programs as part of their sentence. So that is what we mean by rehabilitation. So let's dig a little deeper. So we might want to consider that rehabilitation policies generally require offenders to actively want to change their lives. If the offender doesn't, you've got a problem and rehabilitation isn't going to work. And of course, rehabilitation policies are often quite expensive. They require resources, they require professional support, therapists, probation officers, etc. But you could argue that the initial expense could ultimately prove worthwhile in the long term, given how much it costs to keep someone behind bars. I've included a clip there for you on YouTube, which is about a prisoner talking about learning a skill in prison and how that's helped them to rehabilitate. I've included this clip here, which is about prisoners in a Bristol prison who are learning bicycle maintenance as a sort of therapy and also as a skill that they can use on the outside. And when we consider our links to Unit 2 with rehabilitation, well, obviously, I've mentioned already those individualistic theories, which are linked to cognitive behavioural therapy. So individualistic theories are going to see rehabilitation as a significant part of punishment. And so they would argue our cognitive theories, such as ART. Eysenk's personality theory would favour the use of aversion therapy to deter offending behaviour. Operant learning condition from B.F. Skinner would support the use of token economies to encourage prisoners to behave more acceptably. So all those individualistic theories you could tie in here. You could also tie in sociological theories, particularly left realism, because that will favour rehabilitation as regards social factors such as unemployment, poverty, poor education, which left realists see as the causes of crime. So they would argue that you address those needs, that will reduce reoffending and offending even. So things to consider with rehabilitation. Well, right realists argue that rehabilitation only has limited success because many offenders do go on to reoffend even after even after partaking in programs that are aimed at changing their behaviour. Marxists criticise rehabilitation programs because they argue that it shifts the responsibility for offending onto the individual offender's failings rather than focusing on how capitalism leads some people to commit crime. You can think about that. But I've put three things up for you to look at if you wish to. This is a good clip on Bastøy prison in Norway, which is a really, really pleasant prison, but seems to really sort out reoffending rates. So something for you to consider there. Then we've got the hard edge of America with a Miami boot camp. Pictures of it are up here. And finally, a piece on YouTube from the USA about punishment work versus rehabilitation. Should there always be an element of rehabilitation in punishment? All good clips for you to get some more grist to the mill when you're thinking about rehabilitation. So that then leads us on to our third aim, which is deterrence. And obviously deterrence is just aiming to dissuade the offender or anyone in society from committing crime through fear of punishment. So we're back to our external forms of social control here, deterrence. So deterrence could either be individual in respect to the offender, so it's just deterring the individual, or it can be general, so that's with regards to society as a whole. So if we consider individual deterrence first, well, individual deterrence is aiming to ensure that the offender doesn't reoffend. So a suspended sentence could be an example of individual deterrence, because if there's no reoffending, the offender won't go to prison. And here are the conditions of a suspended sentence, which you can look at your leisure. General deterrence is more about deterring society in general from breaking the law. And this is the argument that if the public see an individual offender being punished, they will see what they themselves will have to suffer if they commit a similar crime. So making an example of the individual will have the general effect of teaching everyone a lesson. And examples of general deterrence in the past are usually anything that's done out in public. So public executions, flogging, or putting individuals, there's a public flogging, putting individuals in the stocks so that everyone could see for themselves the consequences of offending. Now, we don't have much of that in this country nowadays, and I suppose today the public learn much more about the cost of offending from the media, from TV, etc. So it's done differently nowadays. How do we link deterrence through to Unit 2? Well, obviously, right realism will favour deterrence as a means of crime protection because of that rational choice theory. Social learning theory is going to be particularly relevant here, particularly to general deterrence, because if would-be offenders see a model, one of their peers, for example, being punished for offending, they'll be less likely to imitate that behaviour. And we can go back to Bandura's social learning experiment, where if people were told off for hitting the Bobo doll, they were less likely to be copied by the children that were watching. So there's a link between punishment and offending. Deterrence does seem to work in some effect. But there are obviously various criticisms of deterrence. There's actually little evidence that short, sharp shocks or boot camps actually reduce youth offending in either the UK or the USA. They haven't met with success. The fact that half of all prisoners reoffend within a year of release suggests that prison is not itself an effective deterrent. Our recidivism rates are extremely high. And obviously deterrence is assuming that the offenders act rationally, carefully weighing up the risks. But the reality is, as we know, that some act irrationally. They're driven by their emotions without thought for the likely punishment. In that case, it's not going to work as a deterrent. And something also to consider, when the death penalty was abolished in this country, actually the murder rate went down, suggesting that actually the death penalty didn't act as a deterrent. I'll leave that for you to consider. We then move on to aim 4, which is public protection. Sometimes this is known as incapacitation. And basically punishment may be used to protect the public from further offending by locking people up, incapacitating them. So it removes the offender's physical ability or capacity to offend again. And we've had many types of incapacitation policy at different times and places. So just to name a few, you've got execution. I mean, that does definitely incapacitate the offender. They ain't committing their crimes again. We've got custodial sentences. If someone's banged up in prison, they can't offend against the public. In some countries, you've had the cutting hands off of thieves. Very difficult to nick stuff with no hands. You've got chemical castration of sex offenders, which has been carried out in this country. You have things like foreign travel bans to prevent football hooligans attending matches abroad. You have curfews, electronic tagging to prevent further offending by restricting offenders' movements. And if you want to see a little 5-minute YouTube clip on the effects of having a tag, then follow that link there for a very interesting insight into the world of tagging. I'll say no more. Right. Obviously, imprisonment is our main means of incapacitation in the UK today. It's an important part of the claim that prison works, because it's taking offenders out of circulation, it's preventing them from committing further crimes against the public. And incapacitation for public protection has influenced sentencing laws. For example, the Crime Sentences Act of 1997 introduced mandatory minimum jail sentences for repeat offenders. So there were automatic life sentences for a second serious sexual or violent offence. That was introduced in 1997. There was a 7-year minimum sentence imposed for if you had a third class A drug trafficking offence, so it's almost like a 3 strikes and you're out. And then if you had a third domestic burglary conviction, you were given a minimum term of 3 years in prison. So again, it's this 3 strikes and you're out idea. Third crime, you're not learning, therefore we're going to get tougher on you. The public need to be protected. And similarly, the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, remember we'll keep banging on about this Criminal Justice Act of 2003, I referred to it at the start, you can see how it's had an influence here, introduced the idea of IPPs, imprisonment for public protection. Now this actually allowed courts to give an indeterminate sentence to a dangerous offender who's convicted of certain serious violent or sexual offences. So this was basically, you're locked up until we feel you're safe enough to be let out. Now that was introduced in 2003, but actually those were abolished in 2012 because they were thought to be against a human rights abuse. So you can see here, Justice Committee finds IPP sentences irredeemably flawed and calls for a comprehensive resentencing programme. Now the reality is that even though the sentence can't be given out anymore, so since 2012 it can't be given out, IPP is no longer in a judge's armoury, there are people that have been sentenced prior to 2012 who are still serving those indeterminate sentences and are still locked up. So let's think of our links to Unit 2 with that. So biological theories, well, Lombroso argues that criminals are biologically different from the rest of the population, and it's not possible to rehabilitate them. He actually favoured, sending them all off onto an island into exile, so that they were away from the public. And of course, other biological theories have favoured things like chemical or surgical castration to incapacitate sex offenders. And right realists would see incapacitation as a way of protecting the public from crime. They argue that a small number of persistent offenders are responsible for the majority of crime. So if you bang them up with long prison sentences, that would significantly reduce the crime rate. So these 3 strikes and you're out for these perpetual criminals means they're banged up for much longer. And obviously go to America, they don't do things by halves, so if you've got most serious crimes, you could be serving 390 years of jail time. So basically, you're never getting out. But 390 years, I don't think anyone's going to live that long. But there you go. And then to consider with public protection, well, obviously it leads to longer sentences, and that leads to an ever-rising prison population. And of course, that costs lots of money. And incapacitation is a strategy of containment or risk management, and of course it's not dealing with the causes of crime, and it's certainly not changing offenders into law-abiding citizens. And then obviously this 3 strikes principle is actually re-punishing individuals for their previous crime, and could be argued it's unjust because it imprisons them for crime that the law assumes they may commit in the future, if you think about it. So some things to consider there with public protection. Which leads us on to our final aim, which is reparation. And reparation is all about ensuring the defendant pays back to the victim or society for their wrongdoing. So reparation can take the form of such things as financial compensation to the victim, so paying for the cost of repairing damage done to someone's property, a fine, etc., or unpaid work, community payback, making reparation to society by, removing graffiti for public buildings. And this link here will take you to a little YouTube clip on community payback, should you so wish to have a look at it. And obviously linked to reparation is the idea of restorative justice, which is all about making amends for the damage done. And that involves the offender recognising the wrongfulness of their actions. And this is done through restorative justice schemes, which bring offender and victim together, often with the help of a mediator. And this allows the victim to explain the impact the crime's had. The offender can come to appreciate the harm they've caused, they can express their remorse, they can seek forgiveness, and many have argued that restorative justice can help bring closure to the victim and reintegrate the offender into society. And I would commend this clip in particular to you, which is about a mother who has forgiven the person that killed her son, and is indeed friends with the person who killed her son. It's in a one-punch fight. So a really interesting little article there, and a very interesting interview with the woman and the person who killed her son. So I would commend that to you. Have a look at that. Gives you an idea of restorative justice. How does it link to Unit 2? Well, labelling theory would definitely favour restorative justice as a way of reintegrating offenders into mainstream society, because it enables them to show genuine remorse, it permits reintegration, prevents them from being pushed into secondary deviance. And functionalists such as Durkheim would argue that restitutive justice, reparation, to put things back to how they were before the crime was committed, is essential for the smooth functioning of complex modern societies. But there are some criticisms of reparation, because you could certainly argue it may not work for all types of offence. You know, compensation for damage to property or minor offences may be fairly straightforward, but can you make reparation for a sexual or violent crime? You know, would a rape victim really want to face and forgive the rapist? And that, I think, is an issue for reparation. And of course, some people will regard reparation as too soft a form of punishment. It lets offenders off lightly. So, those are the 5 aims of punishment, and then they are all really labelled into one ultimate aim, which is denunciation. And denunciation aims to show offenders that society disapproves of their behaviour and that it's unacceptable conduct. So it's reinforcing the moral and ethical codes, the boundary maintenance of society. Now, these codes may have changed over time. So, for instance, smoking cigarettes was once acceptable and even encouraged by the medical profession. Now it's illegal in the workplace and in a motor vehicle with a child passenger. So all 5 aims of punishment reflect this idea of denunciation. They're all linked inextricably to it. So that's the 5 aims of punishment. That's how they're linked to Unit 2. And of course, you now need to think about applying that to the punishments we hand out. So my final slide, something for you to consider. These are various punishments that are handed out in countries of the world today. We've got the Civil Crime Prevention Injunction, which replaced the old ASBO. You've got community service, there's the description of it. Corporal punishment, that's a beating. Curfews, the death penalty, electronic tagging, fines, mental health orders, prison sentences, probation. And what I think you need to get your heads around is which of the 5 aims apply to those punishments. So when a judge or a magistrate is giving out a civil crime prevention injunction, which of the 5 aims does apply to that punishment? And you will see that a lot in exam questions. When the judge sentences Joe Bloggs to 5 years imprisonment, what aims of punishment are they thinking about? So not bad little activity for you to do. Just go through these punishments and think about what the aims are. And of course, as I said, many of them might include all 5 aims. Certainly most will have more than one. Many will have 3 or more. So that's the aims of punishment. You have to know them inside out and back to front. You have to link them to punishments that are meted out in today's society, and you have to know the vague links to Unit 2. Hopefully you found that informative, and I'll see you soon for my next presentation. Goodbye, have a good Christmas.